Hey you guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are breaking down the drum sound of Obstacle 1 by Interpol.
The drummer was Sam Fogarino. The producer and mixer was Peter Cadis. We are going to figure out how they got this really interesting length in the snare drum. Let's check it out.
For our drums today, we have a 22-inch Ludwig kick drum with a closed fiber skin head. And we have our Yamaha Jimmy Chamberlin snare drum with 14-inch Zildjian K-Suite hi-hats.
So for this song, there was a couple indicators of what was happening here. At its core, this is just a really, really well-recorded, great-sounding drum kit. There's some specific stuff about the length that has a lot to do with the way that the snare drum is tuned and the way that it's processed. It feels a little bit gated almost, right? Now, it's not actually gated probably, but it's just kind of on-off the dynamics of this snare drum. The snares just kind of turn on, turn off. Part of that is obviously the snare drum itself, but part of that is the way that everything was compressed. There's also some indications of some balance stuff that they're doing on this drum set that's kind of interesting and unique. If you listen to this kit, it sounds almost mono. There is not a ton of stereo widening stuff going on with this. Anytime they hit a crash or a ride, all of a sudden there's this width. And then when the crashes and rides are not being played, everything feels pretty centered, right? Including the hi-hat. Now that is a very confusing situation because if you think about overheads on a drum set, which is the way that you get cymbals to sound wide, the hi-hat is over on one side, the ride is over on the other side, the hi-hat is over on one side. So what it kind of indicated to me is that one, the overheads are a very small part of this sound. The overheads are low enough that unless the loudest things in the overheads, which is the crashes and the rides and things like that, unless those are getting played, you almost cannot hear the overheads, right? They're very, very quiet. It also tells me that they are not gating the snare drum very much, right? That they are letting the snare drum and the hi-hat bleed into each other, right? Usually that means that the snare drum mic is not hyper close to the snare drum. It's a little bit further off the snare drum. That's always gonna have a little bit more hi-hat bleed. That bleed is going to be harder to gate. So if you're planning on gating it, that's a really bad idea because it makes that that much harder to do and sound natural. And it also means that any bleed that is coming through that microphone, since the snare drum is pan center, the hi-hat is going to have a ton of bleed that's going to be dead center. There's one other indication that we get from this stereo imaging, which is that we get a lot of depth out of that, right? Out of that snare drum, out of that hi-hat, out of that kick drum, all of it has a lot of depth, but that depth is not giving us width. And when you get depth and you're not getting width, it's a really good indicator that they're using some kind of mono room mic, right? They're using a microphone that is, probably 10 feet to more off of the drum kit, but they're not recording it in a traditional way, which would be putting up two in some kind of stereo fashion. They're recording it in a mono way, and not only does that add a bunch of this depth to everything, it also has a lot of hi-hat. The hi-hat and the snare drum are very similar volume if you stand back from the kit, and if you use a mono room mic, that is going to make the hi-hat feel a lot more mono than some of the other pieces of the kit. So The room mic on this is probably the most important mic. It is the thing that is giving all of the character. It is what is making this drum set sound the way that it sounds. Like I said, there is a bit of a gated sound to this snare drum. And believe it or not, the room mic has a big part of that. Now, we're not certain of this, but to my ears, this sounds like a very specific compressor, which is called the Valley People Dynamite. This is one of the most bizarre compressors. It looks like a Fisher-Price toy. It is plastic. It is not rack mounted. It sits on a desktop. It is 1/4-inch inputs for some reason. It's a very bizarre compressor. And yet it has this character to it where it flattens things out almost completely. It makes things sound almost like gated reverb or something like that. It makes it so that when you hit the snare drum, there is this wall of snare drum, and then the compressor pulls off, and it's so fast that when it pulls off, there's nothing. Very high ratio, right? Completely compresses it to a brick wall, and then when the snare drum stops playing, it goes completely back to the normal dynamics for a moment. The result is this kind of gated reverb-ish sound that is just a room mic. So let's listen to just that mic. So to round out the sound of that room mic, we added direct mics on the snare drum. On the top, we added a Beyerdynamic 201, and taped next to that, we added a AKG 451. That AKG 451 had the screw-on 20 dB pad, because a small diaphragm condenser like that cannot handle the SPL of a close-up snare drum without having that pad on it. And on the underside, we had an AKG 414. We went with 2 mics on the top for a couple reasons. Number one, we knew that we wanted the direct microphone to be a huge part of this sound. Oftentimes, you will get all of these parts of the snare drum sound that are coming from indirect microphones, that are coming from overheads, for instance. An overhead can add so much high end to the snare drum that you don't have from the direct mic. It makes it a lot easier, right? Because if you're brightening your overheads, they just kind of sound good bright, right? If you have to over brighten a snare drum, you end up getting all this ugly high end and things that are coming through from the cymbals, from the hi-hat. It can cause some problems, but the overheads can help you immensely. We knew that we could not rely on that in this situation, right? We knew that we needed our overheads low because we did not want our stereo imaging to get too wide, and we wanted our cymbals to be really quiet. So because of that, we needed our snare drum to be super hi-fi completely on its own. It could not rely on anything else. To achieve that, with our Beyerdynamic 201, we added a AKG 451. Now, the Beyerdynamic 201, it's a great microphone. It's kind of similar sounding to a 57. It has a pretty aggressive mid-range. It is not terribly hi-fi, but it takes EQ pretty well. And it has a kind of good thud to it, but it does not extend to the fullest range. Our AKG 451 is kind of the opposite of that. 451s, they sound almost a little bit scooped or something, right? They have this really robust low end when you put them close to things and use the proximity effect. They have a really extended high end that's kind of effortless. It doesn't really need any EQ to get a ton of high end in it. It just kind of has it. And so these microphones, when you put them on a snare drum where they are taped together, right? Not just on 2 stands, but taped together so that the capsules are as close as they can physically be to each other. This is for phase interaction problems, right? We want them the snare drum to hit them at exactly the same time. These two microphones can kind of fill in where each other is deficient and make it feel like it's a totally well-rounded snare drum. It kind of feels, if you mute one or mute the other, it kind of feels like half of a snare drum sound, and when you put them together, it just makes it feel like a totally well-rounded snare drum just from the close mics. For the kick drum, we had a closed front head. That presents challenges. Normally, you would put a microphone inside of the kick drum, you'd put a microphone outside of the kick drum. The inside kick would gather more of the attack, the outside kick would get more of the body. That's not an option here. So the way that we dealt with it was very similar to how we dealt with our snare drum. We put two microphones exactly the same distance from the kick drum, as close as the capsules can physically be to each other, and we chose microphones that would complement each other and give us options outside of EQ that let us shape the sound. We had a Sennheiser 602. This is a really processed sounding microphone. This microphone feels like it has an EQ on it already just putting up the mic. This is why people like it for live sound and lots of these things where it's like really helpful to have something already baked coming to you. This microphone has a lot of low end. It can have like a kind of a clicky high end sound to it. And it's pretty scooped in the mid range. We coupled that with a RE20, Electro Voice RE20. That is a much more traditional sounding kick drum, right? It sounds like it's from the 70s. It was a really common microphone back then. It has a really guttural mid-range to it. It's not the deepest low end. It's not like overhyped, and it's also not super hyped in the super high end stuff. It just has a really good sounding mid-range. When we go to mix these drums, rather than reaching for our EQ, we can reach for these two faders, and we can balance them based on how much low end we want, how much mid-range we want, how much high end we want. It tends to sound a little bit more natural than just over EQing one mic or the other. With all the other mics drawing the hi-hat to the center of the mix, we also put up a hi-hat mic. I didn't end up using it. I was getting plenty of hi-hat out of the overheads, out of the snare mic, out of the room mics. I didn't really need any extra hi-hat from a hi-hat mic. Lastly, for our overheads, we kept it really basic. We used Mic Shop C12s. They're recreations of AKG C12s. They sound fantastic. They're really, really hi-fi sounding, but they're also full-bodied. We just needed these to be really neutral. We needed them to feel really flat. We did not need them compressed. We didn't need them really anything. They just needed to fill in those cymbals and then kind of disappear. Because of that, we got rid of any extraneous low end on them, and we made sure that they were plenty bright enough, and that's it. that was how we got Obstacle 1 by Interpol.
As always, thank you for watching, and please let us know in the comments what other drum sounds you'd like to hear. We'll see you next time.